So I watched the PragerU book club, hosted by this guy called Michael Knowles. I think doing PragerU is kind of comfort food for the left, but I actually found it kind of interesting. And I need to do something simpler. The last two videos were pretty big projects for me, so I'll more or less just talk for a while. But I'll maybe use the footage as B-roll or something. And I'll put the links in the videos I'm going to talk about in the description. So I watched the ones with Dennis Prager, Ben Shapiro, and Dave Rubin. So I'll do it in three parts, one on each of the three conversations. So I actually read this one earlier this year. The thesis is kind of that what drives people is a search for meaning in one's life. The main part of the story is about how the author Viktor Frankl survived in the Holocaust in Auschwitz. The conclusions he draws from this is that the reason people fail is because they lose faith in what they're doing. I think this is in some sense a very accurate analysis of human drives. What is depression, for example, but the complete failure of summoning the will to meaning, the phrase Frankl uses. His basic worldview is that the world is divided between the decent and the indecent. This then, says Dennis Prager, is the reason why the right wing can't be racist, because that's how they look at the world. So we have 2 points I want to dive deeper into: the search for meaning and the decency contra the indecent. As I return to the same basic events all the time, I think that the destruction of meaning can be sourced to the French Revolution. The purpose of the revolution was to remake society in its totality, or that's what it became anyhow. And there was an attempt to introduce a new calendar and systems of weight and measurement, among other things, according to rational systems. This was for various reasons reversed, but the idea was there. And in the course of modernity, we demystified the world through science. We broke down the social conventions. And through the progress of science, we better understood the natural world. Through the 19th century to the middle of the 20th, Knowles and Dennis Prager talk about how the search for meaning supplanted the unconscious drives of Freud and the class struggle of Marx. There's an important point to note here, though. What Marx and Freud were doing weren't just economics and psychology. They were creating meaning through the understanding of our ability to self-reflect for Freud and to understand our own position in society for Marx. If anything, our modern equivalents of cognitive behavioral therapy and neoliberal capitalism are much stronger tools in the destruction of values. CBT is about our own inability to understand the psyche and tries to make the question of mental health into one of physical self-control. Neoliberal capitalism was hailed as the end of history. So to blame Marxism and psychoanalysis for the death of meaning is pretty stupid. The reason psychoanalysis and Marxism caught on was not because they broke down meaning, but because it created meaning. It made sense of the world to people. If anything, especially Marx showed people that the things they took for granted in terms of societal organization was just much about creating meaning for the working classes so that they wouldn't demand rights. This one is more nefarious because it sounds so innocent. Just be good to people. Isn't that enough? Dennis Prager says this is why conservatives can't be racist, that all he asks for people is to be decent to each other. The problem with this ought to be pretty obvious though. If a society uses slave according to this logic, all the slave owner needs to do is to be kind to his slaves, and he's out. There can be no structural analysis through this lens. One can't problematize societal problems because all that matters is that you are treated well. This establishes also the kind of conservative bourgeois idea of civility. I'm pretty bougie myself, to be honest. But I think it's like this. I rather want racists to vote for a non-racist party than for a racist one. But the way decency politics work is that you tell racists that the problem is the leftists that are indecent. Complaining about the status quo in any sense is the problem because it breaks the social norms. I think this is somewhat a problem of the left, but it's not like public figures have responsibility of politicians. I don't know how people are supposed to disagree while at the same time being civil. Disagreeing in itself is uncivil. So this is why the left is such an ineffectual force in society today, where they have brought the basic agenda of the right of what is civil. This one is really interesting. We're getting into the core of right-wing ideology here. So Knowles talked to Ben Shapiro about the Federalist Papers. I haven't read the Federalist Papers, but I think I have something to say on the subject of the ideas brought up. This, in my understanding, is a very American problem, or it has been up to now. The question of statism or federalism. I understand that the reasons a lot of right-wingers hate Andrew Jackson is not because he committed genocide on Native Americans, but because he saw the Union as a nation-state instead of a federation. In the federal view, America is a union of a number of states with a federal government. While slavery is a large part of the conflict in America, I do think that there is a legitimate view of America as a federation of states rather than a single coherent nation-state. I don't really agree with it, but it is possible to argue it, and here on a conceptual level they talk pretty good about it. The problem, if we read federalism as a right-wing position in this context, is that the people like Ben Shapiro doesn't actually believe it when it matters. As I define it, the federalist position would be that the federal government should do foreign policy, including war and legal matters involving the federal government, while the left position would be that the statist position of the federal government as a place where there are questions involving the entire nation, such as healthcare. If I thought that the Republican Party in America really did believe this, it could turn into a constructive conversation, but I don't. Another interesting thing to me is the discussion of checks and balances. They correctly identify that the point of the American government is that nothing is supposed to be done. Gridlock isn't a bug, but a feature, and the only point where things should be done is when there's an overwhelming majority in favor of the thing. On a conceptual level, I don't have a problem with this as such, but with the practical implications. Where it burns is when they start talking about how the executive branch, that is the presidency, and the organizations below him is becoming the legislative branch. That is, Congress passes general laws, but it's the government officials who do the job of actually figuring out how to make it work in practice. According to Shapiro and Knowles, this constitutes a concession of legislative power from the legislative branch, which I find really strange. Isn't that how it's supposed to work? Our elected politicians aren't experts. We can't assume of them to know the nitty-gritty details of climate regulation or how to regulate the banks. What we can assume is that they have an idea of what direction things should take, even within a more federalistic view of government. The goal for the individual politician isn't gridlock, even if that's the goal of the system. I also want to address something else I've been thinking about. The American project is that men are ruled by laws. The Constitution is this almost sacred text. But when I hear Shapiro and Knowles talk, I come to think of something I think is true. That people should be governed by people and not laws. A large part of their argument is about how local government is better than the federal government, which I think plays well to the idea that politics is about the social relations of people rather than abstractions, that people should govern themselves. But then I must ask, why base your government on federal ideas and not on democratic notions of inclusion? This is on a basic philosophical level, but it spills out on the rest of the political views. And I think it's important to dig down to that level, because it usually explains the view of real people and not the straw man we want to fight. Not that I defend Ben Shapiro as such, but at least Shapiro seems to me to be somewhat self-conscious about this stuff. Somewhat at least. And the problem with this conversation is that Shapiro actually deconstructs his argument in such a way that I can actually understand them. So he does my job for me, but I'll get back to him in the conclusion section. Here Noel talks to Dave Rubin about George Orwell's 1984. The reason this one is interesting is that they think that what the left tries to do is to enforce the totalitarian state of the novel, which is stupid, and I don't take Rubin seriously as a thinker. But the basic impression is that they aren't really angry at leftism. They're angry at neoliberal capitalism. They're afraid of the end of history. They mention that Big Brother in the novel wants to remove time as a concept and that the party is a sealed system. Even revolutions are planned by the party, which reminds me of something Adorno and Horkheimer writes about in the Dialectics of Enlightenment, if about the culture industry. That is, the system is closed and there can't be an escape from it. Even when you attempt to escape, all you're doing is giving legitimacy to the system. That is, within a capitalist society, you can't be a non-capitalist without participating in that system. Even if you create your own utopian society in the woods or in the mountains, the existence of that tiny society is by definition contrasted with the outside world. This is what Orwell understood, that Dave Rubin doesn't. One of the main points of Marxist thought is to uncover the ideological nature of bourgeois society. The system as is, no matter how it looks, wants to be seen as natural, and in the end, this is the conservative position. But somehow, Dave Rubin thinks that Joe Biden is the harbinger of doom. Somehow, he's connected Biden through Bernie to social movements outside of political representative offices, and thus to the protests that have been going on in America in the last months. I have to say that this is the jump in logic that I don't understand. I can't reason myself to see his point of view, and Rubin can't explain it, because his fright is not rational. To take, for example, the thing about the party changing language as a power move. This is one of the signs of the end times, apparently. What the left is trying to do is to clarify language, removing some of the ambiguity. I think ambiguity in one sense is actually really good for language. But, for example, take the issue of trans people. What the adding of trans people into the lexicon does is not a mystification, but a clarification. As I understand it, the science says that humans biologically are on a scale, not in a binary. Therefore, talking about trans rights are about clarifying the status of a person. Meanwhile, they never mention the language games that the Bush administration played to justify torture, calling it enhanced interrogation, or other such mystifications of intent. To return to the concept of time, the idea of time is crucial to progressive movements. It means that there is a possibility for change to occur, that society can improve. It is the conservative idea of time that any change is irrelevant to the human condition, and that there are social relations that need to be in place for society to work. But Dave Rubin is an idiot, so he doesn't understand any of this. I want to talk a bit more about Ben Shapiro. Dennis Prager and Dave Rubin aren't worth discussing in any further ways, but Shapiro interested me because he seemed to find a level of sincerity here. So he said that there is no reason to talk to leftists other than to bash them, right? That's pretty unproductive if a good way to make money. If he honestly wants to talk about his opinions, he can do that. He just doesn't, because honesty doesn't pay, I assume. That's the major problem for me about the intellectual class of the right wing today. But if they could just relax and grow a spine, they could diss leftists in much more stringent and intellectually honest ways. And Ben, friend, if you want to chat, leave a comment or contact me. I'd love to.